Is there such a thing as objectivity when it comes to music? My answer to that question is a yes and a no. Art since the dawn of time, no matter what medium you're talking about, has always rendered itself to be very subjective. No two people are going to be critical or non-critical of the same work. No one is going to derive their enjoyment from something from the same type of thing. And especially nowadays with 50 billion micro-movements upon micro-movements, subjectivity versus objectivity has been blurred even more so. So let's try to unpack this in segments, the first of which being the debate between subjectivity and objectivity and how those lines blur a little bit. Objectivity has to be some sort of concrete definition of someone being very talented or efficient at what they do, or providing some value for the thing that they are making content for, whether it's a musician, a writer, an actor, an actress, so much so that you can respect and admire what they're doing, even if it's not something that you particularly find much pleasure or enjoyment in. From a bird's eye view, you can look at something objectively and say that this person is good at their craft. They know their way around whatever they are doing. And regardless of if it is your preference or not, or your specific cup of tea, you can look at it and say that no matter how you personally feel about it, your emotions towards them do not have any bearing on how efficient or talented they are at a specific thing, in this case, music. In that regard, I do think that there is some objectivity to quality when it comes to music, but this also can become very difficult when you inject into that personal preference. And most of the time, that is where the debate sort of sparks, because people entangle their own personal preference and try to conflate that with objectivity. If they do not find value in something, they're able to sort of put in their heads and brand upon something that it is inferior, talentless, and that it doesn't take any talent to do. And so if you don't see the value in a specific musician or band, you can cast that aside and say that it provides no value to the scene that it is in, the genre, or just you don't particularly enjoy it. Which moves me on to my next point, the blurring line. When objectivity becomes a little harder to define because something is experimental. I don't particularly listen to that much noise music, and in fact, I would say that it maybe makes up a solid 0.5 to 1% of my music listening throughout an entire year's time, and yet I have consistently made a ton of videos about the history of it, where I've went through and researched different movements and tried to get into the mind of this anti-music, but there are so many people, and I would go so far as to say the vast majority of people, that if they heard a piece of noise music, automatically just say it is bangs and clangs, it is just noise, it is talentless, you do not have to be talented to make that sort of music, and therefore it cannot even be considered music. And yet for me, harkening back to what I said at the start of this video, I can admire and appreciate noise musicians for what they do. Do I think that every noise musician is talented? Not necessarily. I think that most of the time, noise can boil down to bangs and clangs, but when you look at the culture of it and what they are trying to create for an environment, for an atmosphere, and how they are challenging the conventional norms of what music is usually conceptualized by, it is easy to see how a lot of people could just discredit that, but you also kind of have to have a broad perspective and an open mind to try to understand things that you don't particularly enjoy. You see this a lot in philosophy, where there are philosophers that might disagree with your entire worldview, that you might disavow entirely, and yet you can still appreciate what they bring to the table, because even through your disagreement, you can look at them and say that their perspective as an intellectual is worthwhile enough to the general conversation of debate and philosophy and the school of thought as a whole. And I think the same thing can be applied to music and any form of art. It is just very easy to look at your own subjective opinions and equate that to an objective perspective. And the experimental part is where that line blurring happens, because I don't think anyone in their right mind, even if you don't particularly enjoy the music, can look at an artist like David Bowie or Elton John or Deep Purple, Pink Floyd, Jimi Hendrix, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, The Beatles, Janis Joplin, Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, any of these phenomenal S-tier musicians that have been canon when it comes to the biggest names in all of music history, the most influential, look at them and say that they are not talented, they are not worthwhile, they didn't leave their mark on the scene. Even if you particularly didn't like Nirvana or Amy Winehouse or the Beatles, you can still look at them and say, yeah, I can get where they're coming from and why they're so massively appealing to so many people. But it's when you step over that line of experimentation, when you're doing stuff that maybe isn't that familiar to people, maybe it hasn't been heard that much, that it can become a lot easier to look at your own subjective perspective, because it is challenging what you are used to when it comes to music, and so you don't feel any talent in that. It's not as instantly recognizable as being talented, because your definition of what talent is and what music is so defined by the classic acts and the music that you particularly enjoy, that more often than not follows a pretty distinctive and recognizable pattern and formula, and it's not necessarily going too far outside of the boundaries of what you could expect. Maybe they put their own creative spin on it, maybe it is interesting in its own right, but it is nothing that is challenging norms. It's nothing that is stepping over the boundaries and pushing the envelope. Even if it is innovative for the specific genre it's playing in, there have been dozens, hundreds, thousands of other projects within that movement that you can sort of draw on the influence of and say, I can see why they are applying something interesting to this. Whereas when you go to genres that are maybe hybrid genres, genres that blend together, maybe genres that take a bunch of different influences and put them together, maybe something that is intended to be off-putting, intended to push you away, something that is intended to be anti-music and challenge conceptual norms, that's when it becomes a little difficult. So ultimately, I think it just comes down to your own personal experience and how you appreciate music as an art form, as a statement, as opposed to just being full stop musical and easy to listen to and good listening. And if you define it in that way, that is perfectly fine, but this is just my take on it and why I think more people should have an open mind with musical movements that they are not particularly used to. What are your opinions of this topic? Do you think that there is objectivity in music, and if so, how would you define it? Be sure to let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear your opinions on this topic. Agree or disagree, there is no wrong answer. But be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.